Okay, Meredith has suggested that we potentially encourage participation and information sharing by moving the team member updates up in the agenda and spending 10 minutes early on. I'm hoping that's not mine. Move up the member updates to the first part of the call so that people perhaps are more attentive or more able to participate. So if we want to, I guess we'll proceed maybe in the same order that we did roll call from east to west, unless there's a better plan to round robin here. Anything, announcements, findings that are coming up, either published or unpublished, ideas you might have for collaboration, future meeting requests or notices, etc.
I'll start it off. Ed Washburn here at EPA. There's a publication that just came out called Wildland Fire, Smoke, and Human Health. It was in the journal The Science of the Total Environment. And it's one author. His name is Wayne Cassio. He is a center director here in the Office of Research and Development at EPA. And after this, I can post it on the IARPA collaboration website.
That sounds good. Nobody else out east? Mountain? Nothing? Okay, Pacific, Alaska?
Hi, this is Amy Fish with the National Weather Service in Alaska.
Hi, Amy. We're round robining and doing some updates here. If you have anything you'd like to add about publications, ideas for collaboration, etc., the list on the agenda, that would be great. If not, we'll move on.
Okay, sorry, I'm not prepared at this moment for that.
No, that's fine.
This is Heidi Strader. I guess something I just wanted to mention that I don't know if you are all aware of it. There is a system, a network of stations that's been installed recently, and it was for seismic monitoring, and that's the US Array system. I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but we've started using it for fire weather indices, and we can actually run the Canadian fire weather indices algorithms on it. So we have an idea of what fuels are like in parts of the state that have previously been too remote to really have any good information on. And we've been thrilled about this, but the problem arises in that they were set out temporarily and are actually expected to be dismantled in the next 2 seasons. So we've been trying to just raise awareness that these stations are out there and hoping that there will be some funding available to keep them around for a lot longer. Like I said, they were set up with a seismic purpose, but most of them have meteorological setups on them now as well. And I know Amy's probably aware of this already because the Weather Service has been trying to make a move to keep those stations out there and continuing to collect and transmit data, because there is a great void that's been filled by having those out there. So I just wanted to throw that out. I don't know if anyone has any comments on it.
That's pretty neat, Heidi. Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask, so since you've already run the FWI calculations, how does it compare to some other versions that are, from meteorology or just the sparser weather stations? Is it relatively consistent, or are you seeing big differences?
No, we're seeing really good numbers coming from them. So the interesting thing with the Canadian system is that we really just need 1 observation a day, and we need the temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed at what is basically solar or local noon, as well as a 24-hour precip value. So even if the numbers aren't perfect, they still give really good trends on what's going on. And we had a lot of big voids, for example, up on the North Slope, around much of Western Alaska, and we now have a whole bunch of stations that we were able to pull. The biggest challenge is that if any of those sensors go down, it's a while until anyone can get out and repair them quite frequently. But we found the numbers are just as good as the data that we've been collecting from the fire weather RAWs for years, as well as from the FAA stations that are around the state. So yeah, it's been good data.
This is Amy. If I can just add, there's also apparently interest in deploying SO2 sensors on some of the stations, which could of course be additionally helpful to human health impacts.
And this is Jeremy. I'll add to it, and Amy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Renee Tatusco at NOAA was coordinating input and trying to rally the effort to at least make the case that these are really helpful and useful, and also to try and pass the hat, as it were, to assemble at least interim funding for keeping them going. I don't know where that effort stands, but as of sort of November or December, that's where it was at. So if you have further input on that, Renee might still be welcoming that. It may be too late, I don't know.
No, it's still welcomed. They're still working on an effort trying to be proactive to coordinate an interagency agreement to maintain the stations beyond their 2-year programmatic lifespan. And Renee has asked that I convey that once the stations are gone, there is no going back.
Yeah, and I think that's the important part. They're willing to spend, I don't remember what it was, Amy, something like $14 million to go out and dismantle all of these stations and bring them in, which seems like a true shame to go to all that effort, especially since they went to the effort of setting them up and they did do the permitting that was necessary. Obviously, those permits would have to be reestablished because now we're looking at much longer timeframes to leave something like that up. But to me, the legwork, the hard work has already been done in getting all of this out there. So we'd be crazy to try to, not try to get out there and make this continue to happen. And yeah, I've been working with Renee and we've had a few calls with a bunch of the different agencies who were involved. And I know Sandy was on the one call as well that I was on. So there is an effort underway, but any thoughts and ideas? I think one hope was that maybe the research community would pick up on this data being out there and would then be able to use it and attest to the fact that this is really valuable stuff.
Also, just one last thing about it, and I don't know too much, but we're meeting with Robert Busby soon. He has some role, and he's lives here in Falmouth, but I guess there may be a chance if folks are interested in some sort of simple samples from all the sites, they're going out there anyways and open to collaborating and doing so. So if that's something that piques your interest at all, just get in touch with me.
Ed Washburn here. You might consider the Subcommittee on Disaster Reduction as an audience that might be interested in taking you up on your challenge of passing the hat. They have a meeting once a month, and the last meeting they talked about wildfires and they had excellent presentations. So they cover a range of disasters, one of them earthquakes, but wildfires is there too. And I think a lot of them would benefit from knowing that that array network is, the clock is ticking on whether it will be dismantled or not.
That's good info, Ed. Thanks. If I can pass that on to Renee, maybe she can follow up on it.
Yeah, happy to coordinate. And I've got a list of the names of the people from the various agencies.
Oh, that'd be awesome. Cool. Thanks.
Your designated representative is Mary Erickson for NOAA.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Any further on that or any other updates?
This is Allison. I just wanted to mention that there's a plan for a session related to this topic at Alaska Forum on the Environment next month. I think it's on Wednesday. Sorry, I don't have a calendar in front of me. And Ed and Jeremy are organizing that. They should be announcing this, not me.
Yeah, I will get to it. Valentine's Day.
Okay, that's right.
I do want to correct you, Allison. Ed is organizing it.
I saw you on the email trail. Okay, Ed's organizing it.
I'm participating because I opened my mouth.
Jeremy, this is one of the times it's good to be associated with me.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind. Thanks, Ed. So you're gonna revisit that later in our discussion here. Is that your plan?
Yes.
Okay. Well, hearing no further updates then, I guess we'll move on to our next agenda item. The impetus for this meeting and its content came from a variety of peripheral discussions. Most of you have participated in at least one and maybe multiple of those at the overlap between the Terrestrial coordinating team, the Human Health coordinating team, the Wildfire working group, and in some cases also the atmospheric team. And this issue of wildfire smoke now and in the future in Alaska and its impacts on primarily more remote communities and IGAP communities, but also the places where the bulk of the people and resources here are to a lesser extent, has got some traction. And it seems like everybody's working on different aspects of this, from the hardcore scientific modeling side of things all the way out to human health and exposure. Observations are a key part of it. And then our interest is in, adaptation and vulnerability, and what science needs to be done to further those efforts. And I'm not sure, I think Allison and Heidi might have participated in the call that we had with Martin Stoifer at UAF. But I think the message that we got there was that the limiting factors for forecasting the impacts for specific wildfire events in the modeling chain they're pursuing at UAF was much more to do with the progress or lack thereof in the atmospheric modeling and the observational data, and they could do a better job forecasting if they had increases in both of those. And I think the sense among the terrestrial ecosystems collaboration team was that those efforts were moving forward, and there were already a lot of shoulders behind those wheels, and so we weren't uniquely poised to do much there. Instead, we thought that we would recircle with all of you and try and frame some collaborative effort among these teams that might result either in more effort towards those factors that have been identified as limiting the forecasting capability, or to further make useful the observations that we do have and could make going forward in understanding the adaptive capacity and vulnerability of those more remote communities. And so we tried to frame this meeting around those ideas and treat it more as a discussion on what's possible, what are we well poised to do, and what would it take among our relatively small time commitments that we're able to offer to do something. And a lot of the email traffic, and it seems, and Ed and Sandy can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like a lot of the actual effort that's borne fruit so far has been on the observation side. And obviously in the state, we know that AMTHC has been interested in this as well, and trying to get just real-time and during event observations and indicators of the problems as they unfold. And whether or not we add to that in any dimension or not is the thing that I'm most interested in understanding, so that the terrestrial team can figure out how to best offer its as I think Brendan and I were discussing our modest capacity. But so that's where I'll leave it for the moment. I guess the question that we framed here is, how can the observations that we do have or that we can make from the different agencies be better coordinated and utilized to advance our collaborative goals? And I've gotten the sense from Ed and Sandy about a number of the EPA and NOAA efforts that are ongoing. And it seems like those are reasonably well coordinated. If you can correct me if I'm wrong. Ed looks surprised.
Yeah, well, I'll get into that. You're reaching the point where it's a perfect segue for me to pick up. You let me know when you're ready.
You go.
Okay. I'll pick up on the words coordination, collaboration, and I'll add the word partnership. That's what I'm going to emphasize. But Jeremy is right that we have been digging into the observational component of that would the forecasters would like to see improved. And it maybe wasn't originally intended for forecasting, but that's a co-benefit of it. Let me just do the quick arc of where we are with this. Under the IARPIC, and the key word there is coordinating, that this is coordinating research, that the White House event in September of 2016, where the initiative on the U.S. Arctic Observing Network was rallied around and launched as a commitment from that event. And subsequent to that, the NOAA folks, especially Sandy and David Kennedy, were essential to launching that, serving in the leadership positions. And I was fortunate to be at the right place at the right time and got involved through EPA. And you can think of USAON, I took this off the website, as the observing crosscut of IARPIC, and to mobilize IARPIC's observing capabilities to support U.S. Arctic research policy. And the other part of it, USAON, is since it's pulling across existing activities, it's building it on partnerships from the local community level all the way to the international level. And at the time that the White House initiative was launched on USAON, there was something called SEAON, which is the international level of sustaining Arctic observing networks that had been around for a few years, was created under the Arctic Council. So the U.S. took a leadership position in launching the USAON to better serve and serve as a role model for other countries to develop their own national or domestic Arctic observing networks that would eventually feed into an international SEAON. So starting down that path, and this was just about a year ago, standing up the USAON team, we at EPA were looking at a cross-section between the human health, that's 1.1, research objective 1.1 of the Arctic IARPIC research plan, and 9.1, the environmental intelligence, and looking for some opportunities there where we could do some quick wins, maybe just one of a demonstration of what this means in reality as opposed to abstract and aspirational. And so when we came to the USAON board meeting in July, EPA had two topics that they had teed up that were very much part of our work. And we would like to see better coordination of observing assets. And they were harmful algal blooms and wildfires in Alaska. And at that meeting, the wildfires in Alaska got better support. David Kennedy immediately chimed in supporting it, said we want to work with you on it. So we were off and running from July on. And what I did was initially began to identify EPA's activities that were somehow relevant to this. And from that listing, I then reached out to the NOAA folks, the National Weather Service folks in Alaska. And thank you, Amy's on the line, Allison's on the line, Heidi's on the line, and Jeremy, you're being brought into the fold too. And there's many other folks. And I put together a compilation of all the activities, and that's what I currently have as a draft. And when we get cleared, I'll post that draft on the IARPIC collaboration team. And from that, a couple of themes emerged. That it was the improved surveillance capability not only satellite, but satellite relying on ground and ground relying on satellite, that these things were there, but I don't think there was enough catalyst or coaxing to the people who were playing in these areas to say, you know, you have a cousin that's just right next to you that both of you can mutually benefit by just talking to each other, and maybe there might even be a partnership because you could fill in each other's weaknesses and be stronger together. So it was improved surveillance capability, enhanced alerts and warnings, especially with wildfires, that there's an enormous network up there of the National Weather Service on their alerts and warnings, and they do have some wildfire capability. And once again, it's just a matter of the folks who are doing this to be aware of other folks doing something very close to it, similar, that can be tailored to the specifics of Alaska and the remote communities there, and use the same network of issuing alerts and warnings. And then EPA has its what's called a GAP program. That's a general assistance program with the tribes in Alaska, where we're building capacity in these Alaska Native villages to do their own environmental protection. And so EPA funds these communities every year, and Alaska gets about 200 of these GAP grants a year, and they total up to about $25 million a year. Of course, that covers a lot of environmental protection capacity in addition to wildfires, but that's a component that can be tapped into and leveraged. And then there's filling in the research gaps of research studies, time and space, and the personal, the part that, you know, as people move around, how do we know exactly what they're exposed to? So those are the themes that are emerging. And from that, we decided to organize a session at AFE, and it'll take place on February 14th. Thank you for teeing it up, Allison. That's in the morning from 10:30 to 11:45. And it is on Valentine's Day. I had a choice there, and I wanted to make sure that the heart was identified as a cardiovascular event and people's exposure to smoke and how you can help protect your heart. So that session is going to be continuing the accumulation of activities and how the partnerships can be formed. Within USAID, you can probably think of this effort as one of the first tasks. USAID is defining a task, and I know Sandy has another task on measuring sea ice, but this wildfires is probably the other one that is got pretty good traction. And then USAID will also be working on a framework that will be connecting with the international SAON framework. The other part that this is a crossover, it's not only the observing and human health, but it's also the indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, because part of this is trying to leverage ANTHC and its LEO network, the Local Environmental Observer Network, which is across Alaska. And that involves a lot of the villages where there is traditional and indigenous knowledge, along with scientific knowledge. And people are beginning to learn about that and whether that can be leveraged, taken advantage of with their observational needs. So I'll stop there and see if there's questions, discussion related to this.
This is Jeremy, and I have maybe a dumb one. But what, you talked early on in your remarks about the potential to go back and forth between on-the-ground real-time observations and the satellite observations, kind of both directions. And maybe this is also a question for Heidi, but I don't know, maybe even Allison, I don't know how that information and its sort of dual direction assimilation gets incorporated into the thinking on the hazard from a specific event. And is that kind of built in already as a system or as a capacity?
I'm not aware of it for the smoke component of it, but I think that they probably are very good at detecting the actual fires and the outbreak of fires and what are the precursors to the fires, because they want to be able to have some kind of forecast ability to where the fires are going to break out, and so they can be ready for that. And
yeah, for the fire event and the, you know, the risk of an event actually occurring, I understand that. I'm thinking on the smoke end specifically.
well, we're aware that ANTHC has a YouTube video that they posted about a year ago, where they are using that to help their communities be better prepared for when they actually observe the haze, the smoke in their communities. For example, one of the tribal members has a rule of thumb that when they can see the mountain, which is about a mile away, they're fine. And when the haze prevents them from seeing a clear image of the mountain a mile away, they know it's time to start taking their protective actions, whether it's wearing a mask or staying indoors, combinations of that, finding a clean room in the community.
Yeah, this
Got
is
it,
Heidi.
okay.
So yes, we're very good at using satellite imagery to track fires, heat from fires, fire movement. Smoke, we can see the GINA group over at UAF does disseminate satellite imagery with, one is a natural color, the other is a true color, and I don't know what that exactly means for the algorithms, but they do show smoke movement pretty darn well. And as we have the benefit of being near the poles, the polar satellite imagery, which has the good resolution, comes in several times a day. So we can get that information out to the field. My role, I don't interact so much with the public. I am passing the information on mainly to the fire managers. When we start to see more smoke, we do work with Alaska DEC as well as the National Weather Service in trying to get the word out. And in 2015, we all spun up a emergency management group where we were having daily calls to talk about smoke movement, how bad it was going to be, where it was going to go next, how long it would stay in a particular place. And we were getting some of that from satellite imagery. We actually end up more concerned about smoke for when our resources are going to get smoked into an airport and we won't be able to send smoke jumpers out or crews or whoever, get them off the ground to where they really need to go. So that's the question I am most often asked.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we can use this satellite imagery for that. So it is being incorporated. Unfortunately, it's not being incorporated into a level where it gets put into any models.
Mm-hmm.
Amy could probably talk about that better, but we haven't gotten, at least not into any forecast models of the large scale. Martin Stouffer at the university has figured out how to pick up some of this information and get it into his modeling, but he focuses more on what acreages we're burning every day and what types of fuels those fires are burning in. So I don't know if I answered any of your question, but those were the thoughts that came to mind when you were talking about it, Jeremy.
This is Allison. I think there's a lot of potential in trying to work from a research to operations standpoint on just that question of the on the ground validation, incorporating models and satellite data. There's a lot of uncertainty right now with the models, and I think IARPIC is really poised to kind of take a step back and look at all the possibilities and start incorporating the various data streams and get some kind of an evaluative synthetic approach to this problem. And I think I heard Amy.
Oh, right. I was just going to add in, in the Weather Service, we have kind of a multitude of arenas that we have to be mindful of, and supporting Heidi to support the groups that she's obviously working directly with in the fire suppression land, or fire management land, I should say. But in addition to firefighters being grounded for their resources, smoke plays a huge component into our aviation forecast services.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not what normally would be a VFR flying day becomes an IFR day, and airports are closed and general aviation is grounded. Those are some of the big concerns that our forecasters in our aviation weather unit in particular are very focused and keen on. We have visibility advisories, which is generally speaking for transportation, but obviously, as Heidi mentioned, we also coordinate with the DEC for air quality advisory. Typically, again, there's not a one-to-one correlation, but there is a pretty good correlation that when the visibility is restricted severely, you have air quality issues. And so obviously we want to be coordinating and we're on the same page regarding those various different types of alerts as well. And there was one other component I was failing to mention, but we'll move on, sorry. But I did want to say that, yes, there is some work that's being done to incorporate some of the polar satellites into more of the high resolution smoke modeling. And that is an ongoing research program and topic that I think will definitely be carrying legs in the next several months to years, really.
And I would add to Amy's, what she just said, tourism is huge up here, and it might not seem like a human health, but to some of the small business owners, it does impact their health, and that they can't make a living if they can't get out and fly their customers around. If they have to shut down for 2 or 3 weeks out of what's really only a 8 to 10 week season, that hurts pretty big time.
Right, and I do remember what I was going to say. So, the impacts to aviation isn't just about general aviation being grounded, but the other impact, of course, with our communities is that they're very isolated. So it becomes a health mitigation forecast at that point as well. Can we get planes in to get people out? Should we be getting people out? When can we get them out? Do we need to be proactive to get them out? What does the weather window look like for the ability to physically do that?
So this is Sandy. I have a question for some of the folks who have more expertise in these observations. In thinking about what is the observational synthesis opportunity, is it that we need to systematically try to do more ground truthing of the smoke data products coming out of, for example, GINA, because there's concern that they might not be accurate? Or is it that these are sort of column integrated products and it's not clear if the smoke is aloft or close to the ground? So that's kind of one question. And then the other side of it sounded like it's sort of making the data products something that the models can assimilate, being a different challenge. So what are some of the kind of actionable observational syntheses efforts that these partnerships could help to move forward?
One that comes to mind, our use of polar orbiters is fantastic in Alaska because we're at a northern latitude, but there are still gaps in the passes. As the satellites roll on by, it's not continual coverage. So that's an important component to remember. We're always looking for ground truth because while our perhaps most useful tool, satellite in polar orbiters, we have swath gaps, and our GOES satellites, or more stationary satellites that are frankly pointed south of us, there are issues that occur with the angle as it's looking that far north toward Alaska. One thing that's beneficial in Alaska is our plethora of daylight during our typical smoke season, but it doesn't always project properly essentially on geomapping. And yes, column integration, I think we're certainly getting better at that with satellite techniques, but certainly room for improvement, especially in the lower levels, especially when you have smoke and cloud cover.
Mm-hmm.
And I know, Heidi, you could probably add a ton more.
I don't think I could add a ton to that. You said it very well. The products we get from GINA, they really are just showing smoke over a satellite image. And yeah, that smoke could be at any height in the atmosphere. So it's really very difficult to figure out what elevations any of this happens at. One thing that we have set ourselves up for success after a big fail in 2015, and then we haven't had any big fire seasons really yet. We realized that year that we had the ability to put out some monitors. We had some available, but we had no one that had the time once we started rolling with fires, to go out and actually do this. So I was approached by a young lady who is a meteorologist in the winter time for the Chugach Avalanche Center. And so she works in the winter and has the summer off, and said, what could I do to do firework? Well, she's really good at setting up these remote weather stations. So we got her spun up with setting up these sensors, and we have several EBAMs that are owned by the state of Alaska DEC, as well as Fish and Wildlife here in state. And then we also found that there was this national cache of e-samplers, which are a little bit simpler to handle. But Wendy is now spun up and able to set up any of these instruments. And our thought was we'd start to see fires pick up in activity somewhere, and we'd be worried about smoke, and we'd send her out to a few critical places to set up some monitors. And then the last 2 seasons have been pretty darn wet, and we just haven't had a good chance to make that happen. So yeah, actually, we were bummed about that. In the meantime, though, we set her up with a national training to become an air resource advisor. We had 3 teams of them come up during 2015, and they handled a lot of the smoke questions. They worked at getting blue sky run for Alaska at a higher resolution scale, and that turned out to be great. And so she's also spun up to do that kind of work now as well, which means she kind of has an in with those e-samplers and being able to get a hold of them too. So she has worked some fires out of state, but she hasn't really been able to go out and do a whole lot of setups of these systems. So we kind of have that in our back pocket, that if we get into another season that's busy, we could get some more ground truthing going. The challenge with most of those is that they have to be plugged into power. So that really vastly limits where we can go. We can't just go out to an extremely remote area. We have to be in a village or a town, and then we have to find some place that's fairly safe where it won't be vandalized either. So, so that's out there. We've got that possibility. And with fire money, it's typically pretty easy to help fund those when we do get into an active part of the season.
That is really helpful, Heidi. And I guess my other question, maybe back to Ed, would be, you mentioned the GAP program and how that's this real kind of distributed resource across the state that could potentially do some capacity building in this area. Do you have a sense of sort of what that capacity building might look like? Would it look a little bit like trying to amplify the kinds of activities that Heidi's talking about, or would it maybe be more kind of low tech and ground observer training?
The GAP program covers general environmental protection. They are aware that the folks that administer that program in Alaska are aware of what we've been doing. In fact, they're closely associated with it. And they have an annual call for proposals. So each village proposes what they're going to do with their money each year. And so there was a window of opportunity in November, and I'm not clear whether that is closed or not. But every year there's another window of opportunity where they can tweak the criteria and what they're looking for in terms of emphasis in a GAP grant. And so maybe if not this year, next year is the one where we can see the opportunity realized and more specifically.
Did you just guarantee that this summer will be a big fire season then, and the next year won't be?
Yeah, put it on me. I'm retiring, so hey. You know, back to Jeremy's question, when I was hearing everybody and what would be that surveillance connection, the coupling. Sandy, you and I talked with John Walsh, and there was maybe some inspiration from his experience in tying into the LEO network, that he recruited a couple of selected observers in Nome to make the sea ice observations, I think on a daily basis during sea ice breakup and sea ice freeze over. And they actually had a very modest stipend that would provide to them. So he was seeing the utility, the benefit of having those people on the ground to add to his existing observing and probably forecasting capability. So I'm thinking that hopefully there might be some inspiration from that to see something similar on the wildfire front.
I know when I worked for the state of Alaska in air quality, they had several locations around the state where they had observers who, or at least people who were qualified to go and do basic maintenance on some of the equipment that was out there. So it would save them a trip for having to go out every time something broke, if it was something simple like flip the tipping bucket back upright again. And so I know that that has been put in place, not necessarily for fire, but it was actually for air quality at the time. And Barbara Trost, who I think you, Ed, you have her speaking, she was the one who had spearheaded a lot of that. So she would know how they made that happen.
I did that for the state of Wisconsin back in the 80s. So I know that calibration and maintenance and recruiting local people to be able to tend to the monitor and still get quality assured data that could be used for regulatory purposes. I realize the challenge in Alaska, though, but you have so many remote areas and disconnected from the power grid and extreme weather conditions that it's really forcing you to be very careful in how you spend your resources there to put up a new monitor and who's going to take care of it.
And you have to be careful about who you pick, because when the caribou come through, everybody just takes off, and it doesn't matter if you were paying them good money. They're going for their meat for the winter. So yeah, you have to really be careful and think it through, but it can work. Yeah.
And there was a video recently of somebody putting a sound microphone up somewhere in Alaska, and the bear came and ate it.
We have that problem all the time with our RAWS stations. There are a couple in particular, and they've even tried moving them a little bit so they wouldn't be on common bear trails, but it routinely happens. And try putting up an electric fence, and it just gives them another toy to play with. So they particularly like the GPS cables because they're soft and chewy.
Well, I'm hoping
that too.
Yeah.
I'm hoping this compilation, it's a Word document, and that it's continuing to accumulate, that we have very good representation of EPA activities and NOAA, National Weather Service, and Alaska activities, and that we can expand this beyond those two organizations and pick up ANTHC and the LEO folks and USGS and NASA and have them add these activities so that then it becomes a really valuable reference document for people to start thinking about. If I'm going to partner, I could pick that one, and that one, and let's set up a call, because it's got a very brief description of the activity. It's got who are the contacts and their email addresses, and then maybe a URL or a little sentence or two about, for further information, here's where you go. And it's, I guess the feedback that I've gotten so far is people are very pleased with it and see value in continuing to see that grow.
Okay, so it sounds like we have one action item or planned activity, which is to keep adding to the Rolodex that you shared earlier, correct?
Yes, yes, that would be my appeal to the NASA folks, if there are any on the line, USGS, and we'll be reaching out to the Alaska DEC and DHSS, Sarah Yoder and Barbara Trost. They're aware of this too. And any of the other agencies that might have, and for example, the U.S. Array Network, we're aware of that, and I don't know how long it's going to survive, but I hope it does, and that could be something else that's another opportunity, and maybe we can get the SDR community to find some resources to continue it.
We, I want to, actually, Ed, I want to ask you a question, clarification here. One of the things that a couple of USGS scientists have approached me about, they work out in communities, sometimes the same communities that ANTHC is in, although they have a bigger footprint, but in other cases they're different. And I've had two people ask me, well, if there's anything, you know, it's the classic offer. If there's anything we can basically do for relatively no effort and no money, we're happy to do it. And some of them are actually interested in different variations on the indigenous observation theme for other work, and or they are, you know, fire and fuels modelers who happen to have other projects out in more far-flung areas of the state. That I think they're looking for a way to contribute and be involved if it's no skin off their nose, but as yet aren't perfectly aligned with the discussion that we're having here. And so if it's not too far outside the bounds of what you just mentioned, I will start to try and see what kind of capacity they might have on the observation side of things, and add them to this list of contacts with a description of what they're good for.
Oh, it's music to my ears, Jeremy.
All right. Well, I think Allison will recognize most of the names from various projects because it's a small world up here, but we could maybe get them better coordinated, and we'll see where we go from there.
Not that small. You're bigger than Texas.
In area, yes.
That sounds great, Jeremy.
All right. Well, the other element of what I was talking about earlier that maybe if anybody has any clarification on, the Climate Science Center's interest in this, and maybe in part also the Fire Science Consortium's interest, is trying to understand the evolving, vulnerability and adaptation potential on this. Obviously, in big fire years, you don't think about down the road adaptation or pre-adaptation to climate change. You're thinking about this year's fire and this year's smoke. But to the extent that there's future projections from a variety of different sources to understand where we might have, we're going to have more fire in the state in many places and more frequent fires, but where those risks are biggest and where the biggest projected changes are likely to be, or where there might be novel impacts that we don't see in the historical record as much. That's gotten less attention in our discussions here and also in the list of people who are working on things. Is that a place where we might be poised to do some work, or should we wait and think about that later and not get the cart before the horse?
Could you reframe the question, Jeremy, please?
Yeah. So what I'm thinking about is, we've invested a fair amount of money at UAF, and also there are other USGS researchers, and I know there's some of the folks in the above program who work on some similar things, trying to understand what the future fire regimes in Alaska might look like, and especially where those are quite different from what we would expect historically, not just more of the same, but where you have fires in places that you didn't used to have them historically. And then what are the associated, I'm trying to use my risk and hazard language correctly, and I'm probably not going to do it right, so I'll use the climate change language. The vulnerability to those new stressors or larger stressors than you historically had, and then what the adaptation options are. I think that we're used to thinking of people on the road network and in the developed parts of Alaska as having the ability to go somewhere. But if your only way out is to fly and you can't see to fly, then you don't have anywhere to go. And ANTHD has explored this a little bit. But I think that one place we might do some good is to at least raise the awareness of this as an issue among those who might either be seeking funding to go after it or who might put a shoulder to the wheel. And so framing the adaptation and vulnerability aspects of it and thinking further down the road than just the next couple of fire seasons and what we could accomplish scientifically, I'm wondering if that's a place where our efforts would be well suited or not.
This is Brendan. I think it's an interesting idea. I guess I have two questions just because I'm not super familiar. So one would be for the projections that are out there, and I assume for these, at least in part, you're thinking of longer term, decades down the road. For the projections that are out there, how consistent are they spatially? Because that's kind of key to understanding new places, different places, new regimes. And I guess my other question, maybe someone can answer, is trying to bridge the temporal gap. We have the the forecasts that are sort of real time, and then we have these long-term 50 years down the road. So what does the state, does anyone know if there are sort of pre-season forecasts, not just about, using, I know that there are some obviously, but like in terms of spatially and how good they are spatially, this coming fire season, it looks like it's going to be bad in this part of the state.
Yes, we put them out. Actually, we do a monthly forecast for the next 4 months, every month of the year. And quite honestly, they suck because we don't have very good information to point us to what's going to happen during the heart of our fire season, which is really June. We know that lightning activity on dry fuels could create a huge bust like it did in 2015. We also know that a bunch of lightning on fuels that aren't quite as dry might amount to absolutely nothing. So it's really difficult to get a handle on that. And as far as climate modeling, I think we're all pretty sold on the fact that it's going to be warmer. There are fuels up, say, on the North Slope that haven't really been super burnable before, but that we think are going to become more burnable. So the areas that typically have been damper are probably going to become more of a problem as we heat things up. The big variable, though, and I think Jeremy has been asked this by Randy Jant before, is what is our precipitation going to do around the state? Our summertime rainfall is really spotty because it tends to be convective in nature. And that is one big driving factor that we cannot really grab earlier than a few days out, honestly, as to understand where it's going to be wet enough to stop fire from happening. So that would be one area I would focus on if we could. In the magical world of pick your favorite study, that would be the piece of information I would want to chase down, is how might our precipitation amounts be changing? We think they're probably going to increase, but will it be enough to offset the warming increase? And then getting that information.
It's not enough. It's not enough
it's
on
not
average. No. There may be places in the sort of the central North Slope and on a weird slice in towards the interior where you get a sufficient increase in precipitation to keep that increase in temperature from making the formerly unavailable fuels available, if you follow that.
Mm-hmm.
But almost everywhere we think of in Alaska as having an active or even potential fire regime, according to Mike Flanagan's numbers, for Canada, you will not have a sufficient increase in water availability to offset the increase in radiation and temperature.
Right, and I have heard that, and I think the hard part is trying to explain that to fire managers or even to the public, to say that maybe, for instance, last summer, it was a fairly warm summer around the interior, but it was also a little bit damper, and people lose sight of the fact that it's warmer because they focus on the damp. And they think, oh, well, it's wetter, we're not going to get fires. So getting that message across that, yes, we're probably going to see increased likelihood of precipitation, but that doesn't mean that our fire regime is going to decrease at all. In fact, it's still probably going to go the other direction. That's a challenge.
Well, and to tie that back to what Brendan was just saying, that's interesting because a lot of the dynamic global vegetation model output that's available, or the integrated ecosystem model projections from SNAP, which are a different kind of, process model. A lot of those are chunked out in a different kind of set of results. And what you're talking about is the change in short-term fire. How do I get it? It's right to say hazard, right? Fire hazard goes up in the future, but also the time window that it takes to realize a certain level of fire hazard might shorten because of these other factors, whether it's the increase in temperature or the loss of continuous permafrost that then changes infiltration. The fuels respond differently to the same temperature because the water is gone. There's all kinds of things there, and I think that we haven't spent as much time, unless Brendan corrects me, on understanding what that looks like, and certainly not in translating it into a useful, here's the kind of unfolding of the fire season you might expect under a climate change future, even, a couple decades hence.
Yeah, and I think Jeremy's familiar with the Canadian system, but basically when we look at fuels, we're looking at 3 different layers. We've got the fine fuels,
Yep.
which is just the surface litter, and then we've got the Duff moisture code, which is the next couple inches, and then you get down into the deeper layers. So there's a time lag on when you have either dryness or moisture coming in as to how fast those fuels react. And I think that the changing weather patterns that we're going to see in the future are probably going to impact those layers differently than what we've seen in the past. So that's an interesting area for research and understanding as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're coming up on time real quick. I think we could, at least some of us could follow this discussion through for quite a while longer and have a lot of fun, which indicates to me it's both productive and we should pick it up again. But I also want to respect people's time. It sounds like unpacking the vulnerability and adaptation part of this has a lot of pieces to it. And I'll put that back in the box for the moment and say that there's probably something worth continuing with there. But that for now, the increase in coordination that we discussed with Ed, specifically centered around observations and the different agencies and what they're doing that could be better coordinated. So we'll start with that as a task. Does that sound about right?
That's fine by me. I'm happy to be on another call if it makes another.
What we do, right? Okay. Well, barring any other input, Meredith, are we good on IARPIC technical details?
Yeah, I think everything is set, and I will work on helping coordinate action items in the next chunk of time.
Okay, well, unless there are any objections, I'll say that I'll thank you for bringing me up to speed on where we're at collectively and what we might do next, and I guess we'll continue our conversation down the road and see where we go next.
Thank you. Nice job chairing the call, Jeremy.
Thanks. All right. Well, I will talk to some of you soon at AFE and the rest of you on the road.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks.
We appreciate it.
Thank you. That was
Thanks,
interesting.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.